At 6:19 local time, the USS Abraham Lincoln was conducting routine strike operations when the Hawkeye surveillance aircraft orbiting overhead called it. 4 inbound ballistic missiles and dozens of additional air contacts. The strike group had seconds to react. The USS Spruance picked up 30 contacts on radar, low altitude, barely 100 knots, pushing south through the coastal haze. 90 miles east, the USS Murphy saw 28 more. The Spruance's tactical action officer classified them in 4 seconds. One-way attack drones, cheap Iranian hardware, worth less than a used pickup truck, but each carrying enough explosive to gut an engine room or shred a radar antenna. He didn't waste a second. General quarters was called across every speaker on the ship. Hatches slammed shut, sailors sprinted to battle stations, and the MH-60 Romeo helicopter clawed off the flight deck with hellfires on the rails. On the signal bridge, the Drake electronic warfare system activated, broadcasting a false version of the ship miles from its actual position, like swapping your house number with a neighbor you've never liked, then watching the confusion from your living room window. At 9 miles, the Mk-45 5-inch gun swung to the drone bearing and opened fire. 70-pound shells with variable time fuses created expanding fragmentation rings that didn't need a direct hit, just proximity. The first burst dropped 2 drones, a third absorbed fragments, lost 1 engine, and kept flying on the other. The autoloader cycled at 20 rounds per minute while the crew fed shells into the breach in a rhythm they could feel through their boots. Lock, break, slew, reacquire. 3 seconds per cycle, 400 meters of closure in the gap. 24 contacts became 21, then 18. 90 miles east, the Murphy was running the same drill. Then the junior officer of the deck broke the rhythm entirely. Surface contacts bearing 085, fast movers, 40 knots inbound. IRGC fast attack craft were screaming in from the east, some rigged as one-way attack vessels with enough explosive packed into the bow to punch a hole through a destroyer's hull on contact. The problem was immediate and unforgiving. 1 main battery, 2 threats, and no version of the situation that worked out cleanly. The Spruance heeled hard to port at flank speed, throwing a wall of white water off the stern to break the formation of the incoming wolf pack. A coordinated group of boats attacking together can overwhelm a ship's defenses, but the same boats attacking one at a time are just target practice. Breaking their formation bought time, and time was the only currency the crew had left. The Mk-38 stabilized 25mm cannon found the lead boat at 2,500 meters and walked tracers across the water until the engine housing detonated. The MH-60 Romeo handled the second with a hellfire, clean and decisive. The remaining boats scattered to regroup. 90 miles east, the Murphy faced the same call 30 seconds later, but with a harder geometry. 16 drones still inbound from the north, 8 fast attack craft closing from the west, and 1 5-inch gun that could point in exactly one direction at a time. The Murphy's TAO swung the gun west at the boats because a vessel loaded with thousands of pounds of explosives was the more dangerous target. He accepted the risk on the north bearing and put the Mk-38 and the 50 caliber guns on the drones while the 5-inch engaged the watercraft. It wasn't a clean solution. There was no clean solution. He made the call and lived with it. The boat took 3 minutes to suppress, by which point the drone count on the Murphy had crept back down to 9. The 5-inch swung north again. On the Spruance, the fast boats were running and the drone count was down to 8. The Phalanx CIWS took over on the remaining contacts, spinning toward anything it didn't like and erasing it from the sky at 20 millimeters and 4,000 rounds per minute. Fully autonomous, because at terminal range there is no time left for human authorization. Several drones entered its engagement envelope and ceased to exist. For approximately 4 seconds, both crews breathed. Then, both electronic warfare operators broke the silence at the same moment. Vampire, vampire, vampire. A shore-based anti-ship missile battery had been watching the entire engagement for 45 minutes without ever transmitting, building a passive targeting solution by listening to the ship's own emissions and piecing together their speed and heading the way a poker player reads tells without ever showing his own cards. It had picked this moment deliberately, waiting until both ships had burned precious minutes fighting drones and fast boats with every weapon system pointed in the wrong direction. The drones and the boats were never meant to sink anything. They were the opening act, designed to drain ammunition, exhaust operators, and set up what was coming next. Nor anti-ship missiles, Iran's domestically refined copy of the Chinese C-802, were already off the rails before the TAO could fully process the electronic warfare report. 4 missiles, wave-top altitude at 5 meters, 165-kilogram warheads, closing at just under the speed of sound from the northwest. The battery had fired at the exact moment when both ships had minimum engagement time and maximum distraction. The geometry was intentional and it was brutal. The Spruance keyed the vertical launch system for the first time all morning. 3 SM-2s punched out of the forward cells and the fire control illuminators slewed northwest, time-sharing between 4 inbound missiles. Chaff rocketed off the launcher, broadcasting radar signatures larger than the ship itself. The vessel heeled hard to starboard at flank speed to complicate the Seeker's terminal targeting geometry by presenting the smallest radar cross-section possible. The Murphy mirrored the sequence. 2 SM-2s out, illuminators northwest, with 7 remaining drones now handled only by the Phalanx, which would engage what it could. The engagements were ugly, the geometry was tight, and the SM-2 guidance problem was particularly brutal on the Murphy, since the missiles fly blind whenever the ship maneuvers and the illuminating radar beam has to slew between targets. But every inbound anti-ship missile was destroyed. Both destroyers remained intact. What neither destroyer knew, what nobody in either combat information center had been told, was that a third American destroyer had been watching the entire engagement unfold without saying a word. The USS Frank Peterson Jr., the strike group's dedicated ballistic missile defense ship, had been tracking every contact on the network since 0619. Her combat information center had been completely quiet, not because her crew wasn't working, but because they had one job and it hadn't arrived yet. They watched both destroyers fight through the drones, the fast boats, and the anti-ship missiles, and they said nothing. They conserved the magazine. They waited. The Peterson carries SM-3 missiles, exo-atmospheric interceptors that leave the Earth's atmosphere entirely to do their job. The kill vehicle separates from the rocket in the exosphere and physically collides with the target at Mach 10 or better. A kinetic impactor the size of a carry-on bag solving a real-time calculus problem that would take a human mathematician years, finding a re-entry vehicle the size of a refrigerator at the edge of space. If it misses by a meter, the warhead hits the Lincoln. On the Lincoln's flight deck, the catapult officer stepped back from a fully fueled Super Hornet sitting on the catapult with both engines at military power. An SM-3 in the exosphere doesn't distinguish between an Iranian warhead and an American fighter jet. The deck went cold. Every aircraft stopped. The busiest flight deck in the 5th Fleet went completely quiet. 5 SM-3s left the Peterson cells in 5 seconds. The rockets burned through the atmosphere, and the kill vehicles separated in the exosphere. Above the weather, above the air, above everything except 4 warheads falling toward a carrier and the cold mathematics of closing geometry. 3 clean impacts in rapid succession. 3 red tracks stopped updating. The Combat Information Center exhaled. 3 down. Then the 4th track split. At 70,000 feet, the radar returned separated into 2 objects, one decelerating hard, shedding velocity deliberately, the signature of a decoy, and the other holding full terminal speed, still with somewhere to be. The SM-3 assigned to that track reacquired the faster object, the one that wasn't slowing down, and adjusted its intercept solution. Not by much, by enough. The re-entry vehicle came apart above the atmosphere and debris burned on the way down. 4 of 4. The Lincoln's flight deck came alive again. The Hawkeye had held the ballistic launch coordinates since 0619, bearing lock from the moment those motors lit. Iran was now in its find-out phase. 2 FA-18 Super Hornets pushed off the waste catapults, and an EA-18G Growler followed behind them, carrying the ALQ-249 next-generation jammer instead of weapons. The Growler doesn't shoot anything. It transmits flooding Iranian radar frequencies with enough interference that any coastal air defense operator still watching a scope sees what looks like an equipment failure and not 2 Super Hornets flying north at low altitude into his country. The package pushed into Iranian airspace and climbed. The lead Hornet's weapons systems officer swept the coastal highway east of the launch site with the advanced targeting forward-looking infrared system, resolving individual vehicles at ranges that would embarrass a reconnaissance satellite. Somewhere in the southbound traffic flow, transporter erector launchers, the heavy military trucks that carry ballistic missiles, were running for blast doors at 35 kilometers per hour. Behind those doors were reload racks, fresh missiles, and the ability to do this all over again tomorrow. That could not happen. The first thermal bloom appeared at 16 miles, residual heat seeping through a truck chassis from a solid rocket motor that had fired less than an hour ago, still cooking through the frame. The weapons officer slewed south and found another, then two more staggered in the southbound lane, already slowing for the turnoff that led to the tunnel approach road. The lead aircraft had 18 minutes of usable fuel over target before the trucks reached the tunnel mouth in 4. Then the pilot caught movement in the tree line on the south hillside. An infrared bloom climbed off the slope, a man-portable air defense system. One soldier, one shoulder-fired heat-seeking missile, 0 radar warning, 0 launch indication, nothing until a bright point rises off the ground toward your exhaust nozzle. The wingman called it 2 seconds after ignition. The pilot broke right, dumping flares in sequence. The missile chased one into the hillside. The wingman pulled off target, nose high, losing airspeed and attack position both, and it cost him 90 seconds he didn't have. By the time he rolled wings level and reacquired the highway, the front pair of trucks had covered another 200 meters toward the turn. The lead pilot checked 4 things in the same second. Fuel state at 15 minutes usable and dropping. The targeting pod showing the lead truck 100 meters from the entrance road turn. The wingman still climbing back to attack altitude with another 60 seconds before he could re-enter the fight. And a second infrared bloom moving south through the tree line. A different crew repositioning along the ridgeline to cut off the attack angle the lead had just flown through. 2 manpads cruise in the trees, 1 aircraft in position to make a pass, 60 seconds before the wingman was back and 90 seconds before those trucks were behind blast doors that wouldn't reopen until the next launch order. The lead didn't answer his wingman's radio call. He was already rolling in. 2 GBU 38 500-pound GPS-guided bombs came off the rails and the jet jumped with the weight loss, guidance fins snapping open, steering toward trucks that were still moving when the weapons arrived. Both detonated within the same second. The valley floor came apart and secondary fires climbed from ruptured fuel systems. The wingman rolled in directly behind him with 2 more GBU-38s. The targeting pod captured the tunnel entrance in the frame. Open, blast doors retracted, empty of everything that had been supposed to drive through them. The package turned south with fuel gauges touching amber. The Growler held its jamming orbit for another 90 seconds, then peeled away, transmitting until both aircraft were feet wet over the Gulf and there was nothing left worth jamming. Iran had thrown a layered, coordinated assault. Drones, fast boats, anti-ship missiles, and ballistic warheads, all timed to overwhelm and distract. The strike group killed every single one of them. Then it went to make sure the same thing couldn't happen tomorrow.